Delighted to have some great folks to sort of share the next 45 minutes to an hour with. We have Tom Raftery and Megan Yeates, Brian O'Kennedy, who sort of has just disappeared there off the screen, but I'm sure we'll have Brian back in a few seconds. Such as the joys of live broadcast. And really, what we're looking to do today is to talk about really, I suppose, the supply chain imperative and the leadership opportunities within supply chain, and how supply chain teams can make a difference in regards to climate change and sustainability. I'm going to ask each of the sort of the panelists or any of the folks that are with me to give a sort of a brief introduction to themselves as well as part of this, and look forward as well to start having some questions from yourselves through this session. Just a little bit of background on supply logistics and supply chain skills week. So for those of you who are not in Ireland, this is an initiative with the Irish government to look at actually the promotion of logistics and supply chain careers among, I suppose, second level students, third level students, and also potential career changes. And it's a whole week-long set of events that's been put together with sort of cross-industry support. And I suppose the theme for this year for the Logistics and Supply Chain Skills Week, sort of three themes. One is diversity, the second one is digital, and the third one is green. And I suppose we're very much on the sort of the green side of things here. So I'm going to ask sort of Tom and Megan to maybe give a brief introduction to themselves. And many of you may already know these folks, but and then when Brian gets back from a tech perspective as well, hopefully we'll have him also sort of join us and give an introduction. But maybe Tom, would you kick us off?
Ladies first, surely, Lorcan.
Oh, no, well, that was quite well. Megan, in that case, having been put squarely in my place there, Tom. That's fine. Megan, and you lead us off then with a brief introduction to your good self.
Absolutely, no problem. And thanks, Tom. Thanks, Lorcan. So for anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Megan Yeates. I'm best known for being the gold medal winner in freight forwarding and logistics, ranking me #1 in the world as a result of my win at WorldSkills in Kazan in 2019. I am a huge ambassador for encouraging young people to enter the logistics and supply chain industry. I have a bachelor's in logistics and supply chain management, a master's in strategic management, and I currently work for the Freight Transport Association across their apprenticeship programs and their membership programs as well. So excited and looking forward to today's event.
Perfect. Tom.
Thanks, Lorcan. Thanks, Megan. So, yeah, folks, my name is Tom Raftery. I've been working in the intersection of technology and sustainability since the mid-2000s and in technology for another 10 years before that. I have been, in terms of supply chain, I've been a VP supply chain for SAP for a number of years. And I run 2 podcasts. One of them is called Climate Confident, goes out every Wednesday and talks about emissions reduction, successful emissions reduction strategies and stories. And the second is called Sustainable Supply Chain. And that goes out every Monday, 7 a.m. CET. I say CET because while originally from Ireland, from Cork, I live just outside Seville now in the south of Spain. So I run those 2 podcasts. I was impacted by the tech layoffs last year. And so at the moment, I'm on the lookout for a new role. But in the meantime, I am what we call here in Spain an autonomo, self-employed, and doing a lot of consultancy work here and there, as well as running the podcasts. So thank you again, Lorcan, and great to be here.
Great. Well, listen, I know Brian is still trying to sort of get back in, and we're trying to let him back in or whatever else into this. So we're going to kick off and keep on going, I suppose, in the interest of time. And I suppose everybody's extremely welcome to join. For those who don't know me, I'm Lorcan Sheehan. I run Performance Supply Chain, which is a specialist supply chain consultancy. So I thought what we would do here is we're not going to bamboozle people with sort of 350 slide PowerPoint decks or whatever else. Is actually what we're trying to do is maybe just have a conversation around supply chain, around the opportunities, I suppose, to address sustainability and climate challenges. But I suppose maybe Tom, I might ask you, just given the background that you have and the research that you have done over time, is maybe as if we don't need to, but maybe remind us of the supply chain, of the sort of the climate challenge, and I suppose the need for us to sort of to drive change.
Sure. Thanks. So in terms of sustainability and supply chain and why we need to do it, there's lots of really good reasons, as you've alluded to, and climate is one of the major ones. We have decided here in the EU that we are going to reduce our emissions 55% by 2030. And, you know, with little context, it's hard to know what that actually means. But that 55% is against our 1990 baseline. We've already, over the past couple of decades, reduced 24% against that baseline. So that leaves 31% to reduce between now and 2030, which is, 5 years and about 9 months away. What does that mean? Well, if you think back to 2020, when we had the pandemic, we reduced our emissions 7% because we shut down all our businesses. And then in 2021, as things started to reopen again, we went back up 5%. So we got a net reduction between 2020 and 2021 of 2%. We've got to get another 31% out of the system between, like I say, now and 2030, just over 5 years. That is a daunting task, just given the context of 2% in 2020 and 2021 net reduction. That's going to be, and this is not a pie in the sky aim. This is actually mandated by the EU across all 27 nations. So we have to get that 55% out of the system. Why does it matter to supply chain? Well, supply chain is responsible for an enormous amount of those emissions. There's going to be a lot of government regulations and legislation coming down on organizations requiring them to reduce their emissions. But it's not just the regs, because if you look at any organization, there are lots of stakeholders involved in this. You've got the shareholders who are increasingly becoming active in organizations and putting pressure on boards to reduce emissions. You've got boards putting pressure on management to reduce emissions. You've got companies, customers saying that they want to buy low emissions products. And so if you have low emissions products, you'll find it easier to attract and retain custom. I'll come back to that. You've got employees as well wanting to work for companies that are doing and are seen to be doing the right thing. So, if you are doing the right thing, if you do have lower emissions or you are working hard to lower your emissions, you'll find it easier to attract and retain good employees. You've got banks and insurance companies, both of whom are under pressure to reduce the emissions in their loan books in the case of banks, or their portfolio in the case of insurance companies. So again, if you are lowering your emissions, you'll find it easier and cheaper to get capital and insurance. So there's a lot of big wins there. And I mentioned customers. That's an important one, because if you flip that around, and we are talking supply chain, if you think of any organization, the vast majority of the emissions of an organization, typically between 80 and 90%, comes from that organization's supply chain, not directly from the operations of the organization, but from their supply chain. And so if I am running an organization and I do my damnedest to get our operations emissions down to zero, I've only tackled 10 to 20% of the emissions of the organization, because what's called the scope 3 emissions, the emissions from my suppliers, are making 80 to 90% of my emissions. And that is incredibly challenging, because, like I say, it's very easy, in inverted commas, for me to get my own organization's emissions down, but it's really hard for me to get emissions from third-party organizations that I'm buying from to get their emissions down. A, to measure and verify their emissions, and B, to reduce them. So that's, I think, did I go on too long?
No, and actually we're not even depressed at this stage, Tom. But I think no, I think that's great. And Brian, welcome back. We tried to keep you out for a little while, Brian, but you fought the technology, and hopefully we're able to hear us there at this stage.
Yeah, so having battled through the supply chain disruption of snow in Dublin to get to the office so I'd have better internet, it seemed to have failed on me. But anyway, I'm here. Hopefully you can hear me now.
We can indeed, Brian. And actually, Brian, do you want to just give a little, just a brief background on yourself and your role in this?
Sure. So I suppose for context, my background is supply chain. I spent, I suppose, most of the first half of my working life in supply chain, in manufacturing and disc and helping IT companies get their products and services to market. And I suppose probably around the 25th, probably 2005 or so, we started to hear about sustainability in supply chain. So the big tech, big corporates, and some of the governments started to ask supply chain awkward questions about what it was doing in tenders and other prequals. And I said, there's something interesting here. Yeah, so I took the plunge and set up Clearstream Solutions in 2008, so about 15 years ago now. I suppose for the first 10 years or so, we were helping companies to understand what it was. So exactly what Tom has taken through. There's a lot of misunderstandings and lack of understanding about what sustainability was. So helping companies just to understand and to do some basic measurement. Thankfully, we're in a situation now where sustainability is no longer a peripheral hygiene factor for most businesses. It's a competitive issue. It's a boardroom issue for all the reasons Tom has mentioned. Our conversations are now firmly with the CEOs and the board around sustainability strategies, the opportunities, the challenges in that. And again, as Tom very eloquently said, the biggest challenge that organizations have is in their indirect upstream and downstream value chains, where it doesn't feel like we control the issues. So working with our network, our suppliers, I just came from a workshop this morning with a large Irish food company who are basically moving food all around the world and trying to understand the various different aspects of how they're going to reduce their emissions from their global supply chain. So it's become quite a sophisticated, quite a challenging space for businesses now. And with the reporting requirements, again, as Tom mentioned, there's no longer anywhere to hide. The expectations are that companies will address these issues in a very transparent, open, and hopefully ambitious way. So that's what we do. We're a team of 20 consultants based out of Dublin, and we help companies to measure, report, and improve their sustainability performance.
Got it. Perfect. And I suppose, Megan, in your introduction, you'd sort of talked about the fact that, you know, I suppose having come from the glory, it's not every time I can invite a gold medal winner to one of our webinars, but we're delighted to have you here. But having come from the glory of that, you've really sort of taken a leading role, if you don't mind my saying, in being an advocate for younger people, for women and others to join supply chain careers. And I suppose as part of that, you're probably most active, and particularly in your current role, in actually talking to prospective people who have shown an interest in supply chain. What are the types of things you're hearing from them? Because they're probably less concerned about, you know, what the EU is doing in the EU targets, and more concerned about actually, will we have a planet in a number of years? So what are the key things that you're hearing, and some of the experiences that you've had as part of that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to start off by stating most of the people I talk to actually have not actively expressed an interest in logistics and supply chain. They're usually career talks, school talks, events where the students actually don't know what logistics and supply chain even is. They know they're going to a business talk, and that's about the extent of their understanding of it. So you kind of have to really set the ground first before you can kind of go into any of the more glamorified stuff around environmental supply chains, the bigger picture, and having to really just set the scene of what is logistics, what is supply chain, the fact that we're an island nation, how everything that they touch, everything they buy in a shop, it has to come across and has to be manufactured and made. And there's so much there to them, because as we know, at the national level of education in schools, it's not something exactly taught. They're taught general business, but not specifically logistics and supply chain. So there's still that unawareness out there. And I suppose that's what we're trying to do with the likes of this Logistics Skills Week, is by trying to create that level of awareness of the impact and the opportunities within the sector. And then to take it a step towards the sustainability piece, it's really interesting because, as you say, the next up and coming generation, they are really, really interested in sustainability and climate change. Not so much up and aware of what's going on at European and kind of regulation level, but they know that there's a problem and it has to be solved. They're very aware of wanting to protect the planet. They hear all these buzzwords with their fast fashion and their recycling and eco changes. And that's what they're really aware and they're really passionate about. And you do see that in the younger generation of wanting to save the planet. You'll often hear about when we talk about the reusable straws and we're using them to save the turtles. And, you know, so there is that. And I think sometimes that's the biggest challenge, is just to get people to appreciate that every little thing they do has an impact, and that we're not looking in the morning to wake up and change absolutely everything in order to solve the world's global sustainability issues. It's those little day-to-day changes that we're trying to get people to make in order to have that bigger impact. And it was interesting to note, I was out at COP28 there pre-Christmas out in Dubai on a couple of panel discussions all about how do we enable the youth towards a just green transition? How do we give those skills? What do we need to be doing for the next generation? And while again, people think you talk about big policies and procedures and rules and regulations, it really wasn't. It was all around the basic necessity of, well, firstly, we need to talk about it in schools. We need to talk about it with our peers. We need to make it an active conversation around what is global warming, what is sustainability, what changes and how they make their impact. Because even talking with UNESCO and the United Nations, they were saying over half of their member states actually don't have anything around sustainability implemented at a national level in their education systems. So it means if we're not talking about it in schools, we're not talking about it with youth, well then, you know, we're really trying to be reactive as opposed to proactive then further down the line, where we want to get to that changing mindset of being proactive in those changes and proactive in those new skills that we develop around sustainability and those impacts then that we can have from it. So it's really interesting to see, and like that is what the younger generation are looking for. They're looking for more education on what can they do, and then that will lead down the line then to them becoming our next leaders, our next supply chain managers, our next logistics directors, so that they can bring those changes forward and implement them then at every stage of the business.
No, and I think that's a very interesting reality check, I suppose, for ourselves, because we can talk the language of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and you know that's very, very relevant. But I think I think what you are seeing, and I think what you really sort of brought home is actually, you know, people want to impact change. And if impacting change means that they're trying to do something in their own life, in how they consume and how they talk to their friends and how they interact with influencers and others, then that's one way of doing that. And I suppose, you know, we're looking at this from the point of view of, you know, we see actually all of these supply chains, and when Brian and Tom talk about, you know, 80 to 90% of the carbon emissions coming from the supply chain as in the physical product, we sort of say, well, actually there's an opportunity to be in the room where those decisions get made. There's an opportunity to be the ones not only looking at figuring out the you know, what you want to do in your personal life, but to be the ones sort of saying, well, what is the type of packaging that we're trying to use? What are the modes of transportation we're going to use? How do we eliminate waste? And as part of this week, actually, our Department of Transportation, who is actually one of the sponsors of the week, put together 6 key messages for the week. And one of those key messages were the impacts of the things that you know, supply chain managers can use. Now, hopefully the technology will work with us here as well. But I think if Keelan, if you're still there, if we can bring up, there's a poll here. There we go. On those key messages, and if we can scroll down a bit on that poll, what that is basically sort of taking a look at are some of the ways that supply chain managers you know, can can have an impact. So it has ethical and sustainable sourcing. And if those are your attendees, if you want to sort of vote for the ones, if you sort of pick the ones that you see as potentially the greatest impact or greatest potential impact, I'll read through them, but there should be a sort of a vote button there. And if you can sort of do those votes, I think that'd be wonderful. But you'll see it there. It's sustainable sourcing. It's eliminating harmful materials from products. It is reducing excess packaging, shifting to more sustainable means of transportation, shifting to more renewable energy and fuels, consolidating shipments to reduce emissions, enabling circular economy, reducing waste, increasing transparency and sustainability. So if you're at the laptop there, or if you're at the piece, I see it at least. I see there's at least one vote has gone through, but just pick the ones that you see as potentially the most impactful. But there's a lot of ways there that those who are involved in the supply chain sector can make a difference. And actually, in one of our promotions for this event, I sort of when looking and sort of thinking about this, there's a research group on supply chains called AMR Research. They're no longer around, but 18 years ago they published a book called Supply Chain Saves the World. And they knew, and they sort of pointed out back then, that actually supply chain resources were in these decision-making roles and actually had the ability to make sustainable choices as part of that. And I suppose one of the challenges for all of us here is why haven't we done more? And maybe Brian, I might come to you on something like that, because as you say, you set up your business, probably 15 years ago. And as you say, there was a lot of educating people for the first 10 years, and it's really only the last 5 years where you're starting to see action. I might be overstating that there a bit. And then the other challenge for us, I think, as part of this conversation is, what is it that we could do differently as we go to the future? So interestingly enough, I'm looking at the ones that are coming through as we do that. So the ethical and sustainable sourcing, I think, is going high. Circular economy is looking good here as well. And shifting to renewable energy and fuels, those are sort of some of the three of the ones that are seemingly sort of scoring quite high out of the 10 with the votes that are there. Brian, do you want to take that in terms of what barriers, or why haven't we achieved more over the last while? I'm not holding you personally accountable, but as somebody who's been working with folks in the supply chain sector for that period of time, and Tom, obviously, if yourself and Megan also have thoughts on that, you're very welcome.
Yeah, it's interesting. We're obviously an experienced and mature audience in the sense that they've identified. I mean, we call it the power of the PO. The power of ethical and sustainable sourcing to drive change. And most of us were in businesses that changed because of customer pressures and consumer pressures. It's interesting. We also see investor and employee pressures now coming down through businesses in terms of focusing them on sustainability. But I think, and I've always felt that customers are the biggest driver of change in an organization. So getting your suppliers, people say, well, what's the most important thing I can do in terms of driving sustainable change? I said, where do you spend your money? So purchasing people and supply chain people are an incredibly important and powerful part of driving change in their businesses. And I think, frankly, the government have been quite slow. I'm slow to blame the government, because we have to do it ourselves as businesses first, but they've been a little slow. The change is coming now with the new regulations, so that's going to change things dramatically. Whether the due diligence directive gets through or not, very clearly the expectation is that businesses, that the regulators are now mandating this, and they're mandating that buyers in the public sector will make sure that they deal with suppliers that are the most sustainable. So that's finally happened. And the other things then are the knowledge and experience. And I think running events like this, where we get an understanding. The great thing about, sustainability and supply chain are sort of the convergence of my two favorite topics. And I think there's a lot of people in the world who are in supply chain who have maybe accidentally, I'd be interested in doing a poll as to how people ended up in supply chain. I don't think a lot of people come out of college and say, I want to be in supply chain. But very quickly, they begin to realize actually there's a significant number of jobs in supply chain, the importance of supply chain, And that's the other side of the impact coin that Megan talked about, is actually when I'm in supply chain, I can now have a very significant opportunity. So what's held us back in the past is, as I said, I think the lack of understanding and training, that's changing. I think the number of people coming out of college now that have sustainability experience, if I look at our own team of 20, I'd say probably the most common, obviously we have science, we have environmental. They're not sustainability trained executives. Actually, they come from other categories. I asked two of the people at the session today about where they came from, the sustainability professionals. One was a lawyer, so ethical supply chain, and the other was somebody who'd come through a transport job. So lots of different opportunities in terms of careers and otherwise. So we don't need people who are experts in sustainability. We need people who are experts in their discipline and who can apply sustainable practice to their business. So I'll leave it there.
And Tom, you've also been sort of tracking and I suppose being to the forefront and sort of in terms of looking at sort of the major trends and particularly on things like EV and other pieces as well. What have you seen as barriers, and are you seeing change, and is the change fast enough?
Lots of
Never
questions
fast
there.
enough
Yeah.
for John. Okay. Never for Tom. Yeah.
Yeah. No. The main, I would say that there are several things holding us up, but of the things that are holding us up, I would say one of the biggest things that's holding us up is the hundreds of millions of dollars and euros that are being spent every year by fossil fuel companies to delay action and to lobby against change. So right there, that's a problem. Also, we are spending something like $7 trillion every year subsidizing fossil fuel companies, which is crazy considering the amount of profits they've been making the last number of years. We are literally paying them $7 trillion a year to destroy the planet. Makes no sense. We need to get rid of all subsidies for fossil fuels. That'll make fossil fuels more expensive, which will make low carbon products more competitive straight away. Already in terms of electricity generation, renewables are far cheaper than any other form of electricity generation. So that's a good thing. What else is holding us up? Politicians are not moving fast enough. We are starting to see regulations coming through now, but it should have been, the regulations we're seeing now should have been coming through 10, 15 years ago, not now. We should be far further along the line in this. Are we seeing changes now? We're seeing some. We're not going fast enough. I saw that the EU electric grid last year was 43% renewable. That's great. It should be 93%. The Spanish grid today is 89% emissions free. It's not renewable, it's emissions free generation. So there's 20% nuclear in there as well. But we're headed in the right direction, but we're not going nearly fast enough. And the two main reasons for that are fossil fuel companies and politicians. They're just not making the changes that need to be made. The politicians aren't, and the fossil fuel companies are the ones who are putting up all the barriers. They've a vested interest.
Yeah, but there's, and I suppose and it's interesting in that regard. But I suppose if we look as a profession, and Tom and Brian and myself and Megan, you're more recently into this profession or whatever else, but we have been part of this profession, and we have the opportunity. We don't need, I suppose, in some respects, to wait for the politicians. And are there examples of industries that are maybe doing better than others on in terms of making this transition? And I know I see circular economy here as one of the sort of key pieces. So I think the ethical and the power of the PO is a phenomenal piece. I think the changing mindset around circularity. So we've for many years we've sort of had this linear economy of let's get better at extracting, producing, and throwing away, than than we've ever been before. But that's just not a sustainable way of doing business. And this transition towards a more circular approach, where it comes back to design, it comes back to design and use. How do we get out of our own way, and how do we sort of use the power that we have within supply chains to be able to move faster, independently of what's happening from a government point of view?
Yeah, just maybe a comment that I think is a really interesting point. If you look at, for instance, Apple's footprint about 70% of their footprint is embodied in the materials that they sell. It's not in the use of the product. It's not in their own operations. It's in the stuff that's in the Macs and the machines. So unless we find a way to avail of the services in a less resource hungry way or less carbon damaging way, we will never get to net zero. So what that means is that our supply chains, which are set up in a linear fashion to extract, manufacture, distribute, and sell and waste, we need to turn those into circular supply chains. That presents huge opportunities. So I'm always glass half full on this one. The opportunities there from a technology, traceability, aftermarket services, repair services, life extension, to just there's so many ways, and you see it in certain industries that have managed to pivot. So you see it in the sharing technologies that are out there now around transport, the innovation and the additional services and benefits that can come with that, the customer loyalty that comes with the sharing economy. So we have to change, and that's hard because any circular economy means we have to change our business models, we have to change our systems, our buyers and suppliers need to engage in a different way. So that's difficult, and particularly for some big companies. So for smaller, innovative, more agile organizations, they find it a little easier to engage in the circular economy. Those with big linear engines globally find it very hard to change. But I think there's so many opportunities in there for disruptors and for young people, frankly, who are not as attached to their stuff as us oldies. I think the world is going in that direction. So I'm really hopeful with that, because otherwise we'll never shift. We'll never get to net zero if we don't stop digging stuff out of the ground and burning it.
And actually, equally though, I think a lot of people talk about retention or about attracting younger people and a new generation into supply chain. But I suppose one of the things you can find very quickly is we have a very mobile population these days as well, and people who will vote very quickly with their feet, even if they make a decision to join. If they don't see that the pace of change or the things that they were talked about when they did join an organization, they're very, very quick to sort of say, well, actually, you know what, life's too short to waste in an organization or to doing things that are not driving value. Megan, just from you and from what you see, is there a danger here? There's a huge opportunity in supply chain, obviously, to have the power of the corporate PO as opposed to our own personal PO to be able to drive change. But is there also a real risk that if we don't get out of our own way and we don't enable this new generation of supply chain professionals to really enable change, that they'll sort of say, well, yeah, this is fine, thanks very much, supply chain, it was nice for a while and a nice concept, but unless you can really allow us to be active and to drive change, then this isn't where we want to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting to know, when I did my master's, I did my research thesis on the skills retention within the logistics sector and why it's so low. So we can talk about all these initiatives to get people in the door, as you say, but why do we spend so much time educating them, training them up, and then a few years down the line, all of a sudden they're in a new industry? They've jumped ship, even though, as we say, the opportunities are there, room for progression is there. We saw during COVID, it was the one industry who only got busier, if nothing else, and only grew. And the interesting thing that came out of the research was that people aren't leaving the logistics industry itself. They're not leaving because the opportunities aren't there. They're leaving because of poor company culture and poor management. And that's the exact reason why. And, we all know it. It's not a secret. There can be at times some old-fashioned mentality or stuck in our ways of, this is the way we always did it, so we'll keep doing it. It worked before, so it'll work again in the future. And I think the younger generation isn't of that mindset. The younger generation and the incoming ones, they want to see change. They want to make progress. They want to do things a new way. They want to try, adapt things. They want to try be innovative. And I think at times that can scare companies. They like success and they like doing things the way they know they work. They know they can get results out of it. And I think, you know, that younger generation, if they're not given those opportunities to try change things, well, then they'll go somewhere else where they will find that, maybe whether it be other companies, other sectors, other areas where they can implement those ideas and they can see changes that are tangible then for them. So I think it's all around that space of, you know, trusting in the incoming generation that, you know, they are highly educated. It comes from a good place. They do want to make change. They do want to see businesses be successful and they want to be part of that. But of course, as we all are, we are only human at the end of the day. We are all reluctant to change. And it's just, I suppose, being able to take that first step to make those changes and see that happen.
Yeah, I think you make some incredibly valid points. You know, when you look at this, and as I try and reconcile sort of my 30 or 40 years of, you know, career and learned behaviors here, and maybe some of the, you know, the biases that we come to. As you were saying that, I was thinking actually, well, how, you know, how we got to where we've got to, and in some respects, particularly in Ireland, we're probably on our third generation of sort of supply chain, because Ireland really started as a manufacturing base for a lot of multinationals, and over time, as manufacturing transitioned out, then, you know, the management of the supply chain, supply chains that are now being executed around the world, as a lot of that management of supply chains is still happening here for the, you know, for the Googles, the Metas, the Apples, the, you know, the healthcare companies and the various other ones. But I suppose if you think of how in my generation, of how we got into supply chain, I'm a reformed accountant. I didn't start with a supply chain piece. We have a lot of, you know, ex-accountants, ex-engineers, and others who've come into the profession, and we've learned by doing, and we've learned by being part of it and by sitting beside whoever it was. You know, we early in my career, we worked with HP, with Microsoft, and others. And we learned a huge amount from those large organizations on how things worked. And I think we've now got an opportunity where the next generation of supply chain leaders aren't coming in necessarily from manufacturing or necessarily from those pieces. We have a lot of really highly educated people coming through, and also people who are coming through with opportunities through apprenticeships and other pieces to actually get some of the theoretical and other frameworks. And we need to be able to, as you say, trust them, and to give them that, you know, access to the power and to listen to them. So I think that culture word keeps actually coming up this week. You know, when we talked about on Monday in one of our events, we talked about you know, diversity, and culture was a huge part. You know, during the week we talked about digitization and the transition to a more digital and elimination of waste. And again, culture and the barriers really came up as a significant, you know, challenge for change. So I think you make some great points here about our need, I suppose, to look at ourselves in the mirror. You know, yes, we can, you know, we know governments need to do more, we know politicians need to do more, but generally we're in a profession where, you know, we can have 100 people in a room in, you know, one of these events, you know, during the week, probably with a collective spend, Brian, of, you know, tens of billions of supply chain PO dollars. And the people in that room have the power to have real influence on that. So I think one of the real challenges for ourselves is, you know, what do we need to do and how can we unlock that power that we have? Is the data that we're now starting to see, say maybe through the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, starting to realize for some companies, or show the path for some companies of what they need to do differently? Because, you know, I think back a couple of years ago, Brian, as you were talking about, where, you know, to be sustainable, all you need to do is have 4 paragraphs at the back of your corporate report of the 3 things that you did that you could categorize as sustainable for the year. But when you see those 4 paragraphs don't really add up to a hill of beans, maybe having the stark data in front of us is the shock that we need.
Yeah, so there's absolutely an issue with data, and data is really important. But actually, I think probably the biggest issue and the biggest change that we're seeing is a focus on impact. And if you take a lot of the attempts. Let's take the new reporting regulations from Europe, the CSRD, which is everybody corporate reporting sustainability directive, which basically pretty much every company over 250 people is going to have to report on a range of data and sustainability activities and all the rest. It's a disclosure format, but the biggest part of the most interesting part of that process is not the actual output, the disclosure. It's actually the requirement on companies to do what's called a materiality assessment, and it's a double materiality. So you have to look at the impacts that you have externally. So what are we pumping out by way of emissions, or what impact do we have externally on the world? But you also have to look at that from an external perspective in. So what are the changes in climate and biodiversity and social changes going to have on our business? And that's a really interesting change in the dynamic. So it's not that no longer that tick box that we have ISO this, we've got a carbon footprint. Maybe we've even said science-based targets, which is leading best practice. But actually it's forcing us to talk about the impact. And that to me is where then the skills change a little bit, because rather than, and we do need data, and we need people who are data analytics qualified. That's a very important skill in supply chain and sustainability at the moment. But actually, people who have purpose, who are passionate, we're finding. Somebody asked me recently, we've hired, say, 20 people probably in the last 5 years. What's the common theme that runs through that? And they all have clear purpose in terms of the world. I thought you rather unfairly gave the running out of time to the young people. It's the old people like me who are running out of time in terms of making change. So we have a more urgent job to do. But all of these young people are coming out looking for a job with purpose, where their passion and talents can be used. And when you start to think about the impacts that business have externally and also the impacts the outside world has, then the skill set becomes much more nuanced and much more about the talent and our experience from other parts. So whether it's lawyers, accountants, economists, so that variety of understanding of impact and risk and opportunity is actually probably where we really need the skills going forward. Yes, the tools will come. Yes, the training needs to happen. All of those infrastructural things need to happen in the background. But fundamentally, they're the types of people that we need. And I think Irish people score, I would say modestly, we're pretty good at that. And I think that's probably where some of our skills in the supply chain world have led us to positions of leadership. It's that ability to bring all that together, to see the bigger picture with purpose and passion and enthusiasm.
Yeah, and I love the fact that you're calling out the different skills. I think at one of our conferences during the week, we had a keynote, and I'm going to forget the lady's name here, but she talked about we needed more artists, people who will come with the crazy ideas. If you fill a room with data analysts and you give them data, you're going to get pretty much the same answer. But you need to throw some artists into the room as well, who will actually ask the questions that aren't being asked, who will think of the weird and wild and wonderful things and challenge us to do things differently.
Can I just recount a very short little story? For the workshop we did this morning, we asked, this is a group of technical procurement group.
Yes.
Technical managers, most of them that was their title. We asked them to draw what they thought was the most responsible supplier. What animal would you pick as being the most responsible supplier? So it's fascinating. So we got bees, we got ants, we got bears. But what really freaked them out was asking a bunch of technical people to draw a picture. But honestly, to fix sustainability in supply chains, when they did it and they started to equate it to a particular animal, it was incredible. The innovation and the ideas about collaboration and cooperation and support and all of those things that you want your suppliers doing in a responsible supply chain basis. But the drawing piece was really challenging for them.
There you go. We definitely need more artists in that case. As part of that. Are there things, Tom, from as part of your podcast series as well? You obviously get to listen to some companies that are doing things well and some sort of providers that are really trying to sort of innovate and provide solutions? Are there things that give you hope? I suppose part of it is the fact that some of the renewables are now so much cheaper, because that wasn't always the case, and you know, those curves, and I've seen you publishing those curves over many years. um, what are the things that give you hope in terms of, okay, we have the ingredients here, if we can now just get the momentum and the will to make those changes?
Yeah, there's a few things that there are some companies that are doing really incredible things. I spoke to a guy called Lucas Joppa when he was he was chief sustainability officer for Microsoft a few years ago. And what they were doing was really, gold standard, platinum standard, if you want.
Yeah.
They initiated internally an internal carbon price on all their projects, for example, and just I think it was like $60 a ton of carbon, and they ring fenced all the money that was collected from those projects, from the carbon tax on those projects, and they put it into a lot of their sustainability initiatives. So they made sure that it was only spent on sustainability projects. They also have said that they want to go carbon negative, not carbon neutral, not net zero, carbon negative, and they want to take out of the atmosphere all the carbon that their company has been responsible for emitting since they started business in 1975. And I've not heard any other company say anything of that sort. And it's great to throw out, wild aims like that, but they're actually backing it up with money. So they've put out an RFP, for example, for a million tons of CO2. Nobody knows how to get a million tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere. So what they're doing right there is they're seeding innovation. They've also put up a $1 billion innovation fund for carbon removal projects. So they're doing lots of things, and they've done a ton of other things as well. We could spend an hour just talking about all just Microsoft's initiatives.
Yeah.
So when you see leading companies doing things like that, that gives you hope. You mentioned the price drops in renewables and lithium-ion batteries for storage as well. That gives a lot of hope. We're seeing at the moment the debate in the EU around the CSDDD, the CSDDD legislation. That gives pause, but at least we're heading in the right direction in terms of the regulations. We're getting more of the CSRD that we mentioned a second ago that Brian talked about. When you start to see regulations like that coming out, not just the EU, we saw California in passing laws like that as well, and there's more coming in other regions. So regulations are going in the right direction, not fast enough, but they're going in the right direction, and they're mandating companies make these kind of changes, the changes that are required for the ones who aren't as leading as some of the larger companies like Microsoft. But a lot of those things are giving me hope. Regs are going in the right direction. Prices are going in the right direction. Some leading companies are leading people in the right direction.
Yeah.
There are solutions out there as well for capturing data. And a lot of people, what they're doing at the moment for scope 3, for measuring their scope 3, is they're kind of going, it's around 42, or doing it on price-based estimates, that kind of thing. And that's, it's better than nothing, mostly. But what you really need is access to primary data. And that's where the likes of, again, technology, digitalization, sensors and communication can help a lot, because we need sensors and smart comms telling us exactly what's going on everywhere. So we need our supply chains to be more transparent to enable us to see these kind of things. We talked about the power of the PO. Brian mentioned that at the start there. That's hugely important, and that may be underappreciated. So I wanted to say it again, because that 80 to 90% of scope 3, that 80 to 90% of emissions coming from the supply chain, that's where the power of the PO strikes. Because if you are looking down through your suppliers and you are deciding where to spend your money based on not just price, but also emissions, right there, you're impacting your scope 3 emissions. You're deciding how much emissions your company is going to have in its supply chain by choosing the supplier with the lowest emissions. So you need to be going out to your suppliers and saying, okay, I need you to be reporting your emissions, and I need it to be not estimates. I need it to be based on actual data that I can see. a lot of the legislation is going to require this anyway.
Yeah.
And we're going to get to a point where emissions are going to have to be reported with the same kind of rigor as financial statements.
Yeah. No, and I think that's welcome. As much as I always find it hard to get excited about regulations, you know, as many people do, but I think regulations are probably needed because there's a series of laggards who would just not move.
Yeah.
But I think we need to do more to seed the leaders and to seed the changes. And you know what gives me hope as part of this is, you know, supply chain organizations. If you look back to pandemic, supply chains were all about you know, forecast predictability, you know, systems, transportation, all of the things, you know, putting order on things. And pandemic we sort of suddenly our factories shut down. Suddenly our transportation systems were gone. The retail infrastructure was, you know, shutting down around the world, and yet supply chains found a way, and supply chain teams found a way to get product to market, to keep people fed, to to get to get us all the laptops and all the cameras and all the things we needed to do to change how we did work, and they did it overnight. And there's a phrase we used before, which is, you know, it's like putting a rock in a stream. You know, the supply chain teams will find a way to sort of get the water still to where it needs to get to, even if the rock is in the way. And I think part of what gives me hope is that we have all of this capability within supply chain, and we have them. You give them a problem, and they will jump to solve it. And that's where the visionary statements are important. Even if we don't know how to get to negative, you know, from a carbon point of view, the fact that we've set that as the target, now we've got teams of people working on that, and teams of really, really smart people. And the challenge has been, I suspect, that the targets we've been setting these supply chain teams have been around cost reduction, have been around different pieces. And we need to change things in the corporate boardroom or whatever else to say, actually, the new imperative is, you know, what are we doing around climate? What are we doing to save this planet? And the supply chain teams are absolutely there and ready and willing to move forward and actually put the same intellectual capability to solve for that. And you know, Microsoft will solve for that. You know, when I see things like circular economy, you know, I struggle with some of these terms. People are, what the hell, circular economy, and why is that? You know, and the one that got me was, you know, you know, data centers get a tough rap, right? in a lot of cases, right? And the one that got to me is, well, if you think of data centers around the world, I'm going to make numbers up here for the sake of illustration. They're putting 3 million new servers in every year. And when they're putting it to cope with all the new data requirements, and when they put in those 3 million servers every year, they know that in 5 years' time they're going to need to replace those 3 million servers because the technology will be obsolete. And in the linear economy, you're building those 3 million servers, and in 5 years' time, you're ripping them out, throwing them out, and you're building another 3 million or maybe 5 million servers at that stage. And in the circular economy version is, you're thinking, well, if I know I'm going to be throwing this out in 5 years' time, how can I now design something that in 5 years' time or 4 years' time, that instead of throwing those things out, I've actually built it in such a way that it feeds itself, and you're closing that loop. And that for me, it sort of got my head around, well, what do you really mean by circular? It's a different mindset, that before you even build it, you're thinking about that end of life. And I think the opportunities are there for people to be able to enter this industry, to be part of that transition. And hopefully by the time they are joining this industry, we're also sort of, as leaders, and I think it's up to us all to sort of stand up and speak out. We're all sort of saying, actually, we need to be the ones, you know, whether we're not waiting for regulation, we're not necessarily even waiting for the corporate leadership. We are showing from sustainability, or from a supply chain point of view, what's possible in sustainability. We're coming to the top of the hour here. I'm going to come back to you, Megan, in terms of, obviously you're there, and we have, and look, you're an incredible person in terms of the energy and the enthusiasm you bring for all things supply chain. But just for those who are looking at this and sort of saying, okay, well, there's potentially an interest here, where do they go, or how do they get involved? You know, do they knock on Microsoft's sort of front door? Is there a secret thing on sort of Excel where you can say, I want to be part of the supply chain, part of the solution? What advice would you give to them to sort of where do they go, and who do they talk to about starting a career in supply chain?
Yeah, I think now we have so many options that we didn't have even just a few years ago. And whether you're coming out of school, whether you're a career changer, whether you're 30 years doing a job and want to try something new, there's the opportunities for everyone. I mean, there's everything from short courses, traineeships, apprenticeships, bachelor degrees, master degrees. You can come in at any level. I suppose like that's the amazing thing, whether you have transferable skills that you can bring in or transferable knowledge from other departments or other areas of business. There's always opportunities, as we say, up and down the supply chain and across it, from manufacturing to engineering to transport to operations. So many people won't even realize that they already have skills there that are so beneficial in the supply chain that can be used. So I suppose the easiest place to start going for information is there are so many websites and so many different areas, but I suppose the Department of Transport having their Logistics Skills Week website, there's loads of information there with loads of useful links. For those who are from a school age level, Careers Portal has a whole section dedicated to logistics and supply chain careers, and that'll give all the education training options there as well. And for those in industry who are looking for opportunities, I suppose that's one area where I know we've spoken about before, is because there is no standardized titles. If someone wants to become an accountant, you can just Google accounting jobs and you'll find them all across the sector. But it's very hard to narrow down, well, if I want to join supply chain, well, do I want to join procurement? Do I want to join warehousing? Do I want to join logistics? There's so many different titles and so many different job opportunities that maybe it is a case more so of maybe identifying a business you would like to work for and then inquiring with that business what opportunities they have within their logistics and supply chain area. But there's the endless opportunities that are out there. So there's definitely something for everybody within logistics and supply chain, is what I'd say.
Perfect. Good. Any closing comments from yourself, Megan, and then I'll open it up to Tom and to Brian.
I'll just say that there are, as I say, so many opportunities, and I think, you know, that's the message we need to get out to people, is it's not the old school working in a warehouse or driving a truck, that there are so many different avenues, so many different sectors. I mean, you could be in marketing and you could be marketing for a supply chain and transport company. You could be in accounting and doing accounts for logistics and transport. Like, you can come in from absolutely anywhere, any area of interest, and have those opportunities that we speak about. So I think to anyone who even has a slight inkling that they'd like a career change or they'd like to find out more, definitely research it. Because going back to, I think it was Brian at the start said, you know, how do people end up in logistics and supply chain? Well, I'll hold my hands up and say I stumbled into it. I didn't wake up one morning and decide I was going to work in logistics and transport. And it was just pure chance by research that I came across a course in it that piqued my interest. So I think it's trying to get more people to make that conscious decision to research into it and come into it with an open mind. And I think definitely all these events and all these conversations we're having is bringing us in the right direction.
Perfect. Good. Tom?
Yep, I fell into it as well. I'm a biologist by training, so absolutely well left of biology here, but getting back into it now as biodiversity starts to rear its head in sustainability conversations. The one thing, just to feed off what you said, Lorcan, a minute ago, one bit of advice I often give companies as a kind of a lever for getting emissions down is, if you make executive remuneration if you make the executive remuneration tied to emissions reduction KPIs, suddenly you can start to see some real action taking place. So that's always one to consider. And for people who are considering a job in supply chain and why it might be a good idea, well, like I said, supply chains are responsible for 70, 80, 90% of the emissions of a lot of organizations. It is an enormous lever. It's somewhere where you can really really make a difference in getting emissions down. So I think if anyone is thinking that they want a job with purpose, supply chain is where you can actually make a significant difference.
Good. Brian.
Yeah, look, beautifully said. I think the career opportunities in supply chain, and particularly at the intersection of supply chain and sustainability, are have enormous impact and have enormous potential for those that are minded to drive purpose and change in the world. As I said, I'm only just fresh in my mind the legal minds that I met, the supplier engagement, the training, all of the issues that have to be done. So if your skills are in any of those places, the other thing I find about supply chain is that there just seems to be, from those that do supply chain courses, particularly postgrads or some form of additional training, there's a really high instance of job placement. So the demand is there. It's just something that we don't necessarily think about for whatever reason. So yeah, great opportunity to start. And you're, as Megan said, you're not necessarily stuck in it. You can wander into different aspects of it. So great place to start.
Good. Well, look, and I want to thank you all for that. And look, the only other thing I would say to people considering this intersection, if you think of the amount of change that's happening and going to happen here right now, is in many ways the jobs haven't been written. The job specs haven't been written for the types of career opportunities that are going to exist in this area. So those that are in there and at the forefront of it really have the opportunity in many ways to actually help shape the types of careers and the types of things that they're going to be involved in. Time is against us. I really, really appreciate the three of you for joining the conversation.